he sent a memo that everybody should read.
To
because in
Condoleezza Rice.
2008, yeah, he explained, my God, this NATO enlargement business is absolutely dangerous. And of course, George Kennan a decade earlier, and George Kennan was absolutely brilliant and understood already in the 50s how we could have gotten out of the Cold War. But certainly in 1997, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times when they still ran such op-eds, that this whole NATO enlargement business was absolutely reckless. And what's interesting, when Kennan was writing that in 1997, I hadn't actually realized it until I went back and saw a reference to an article in Foreign Affairs by Zbigniew Brzezinski that I didn't remember, writing in 1997, laying out almost the precise timetable for how we were going to incorporate Ukraine into NATO. Now, this is years before Putin's president. This is when we're not having any war with Russia. People tell me, oh, yeah, well, they have to be in NATO. Look at Putin, madman. But this is well before, and Brzezinski lays out basically to the year the sequence of how it's going to be the first row of countries, which was Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. Then it's going to be the next row. Then Ukraine by 2005 to 2010, he writes, they're going to have their invitation. It turned out to be 2008. Our ambassador to NATO in 2008 was none other than Victoria Nuland. If you want to know what deep state means, she's been in every administration. She's been almost every night.
Except when Trump was elected. That's the only way apparently to get her out of the government.
Except Trump.
Yeah.
So she was Cheney's advisor. She was ambassador to NATO when we asked Ukraine to come in. She was the point person on the U.S. engagement in the violent overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014, which started the war in Ukraine. And she is now promoted for all of this, bringing us ever closer to disaster. And by the way, putting Ukraine in the classic place in a proxy war guaranteed to destroy that country, which is exactly what it's doing.
You know, the thing that struck me so much about that Bill Burns memo in 2008, when he was warning Condoleezza Rice and others in the Bush administration about the insanity of this plan, was he said, it isn't just Putin. You go and talk to every single person of influence in Moscow, even Putin's liberal critics, and it's all, for every last one of them, a huge red line to be mucking around in Ukraine for the West, in part because of the history of the 20th century. And that's what I wanted to ask you. You gave this interview in February of 2023 with Isaac Chadner of The New Yorker, who has become this hero to the liberal establishment because of these adversarial interviews he purportedly does. A lot of it is based on how transcripts get edited, how much he gets to say, how much the guest gets to say. I've done a couple of those with him, so I know firsthand. One of the points
what a low life approach to journalism.
Completely. I mean, mine I felt ended up being pretty fair, but I've seen him done incredible hatchet jobs with others, including yours, because one of the points you kept trying to make was that the premises of his questions, embedded in them, they were almost like, when did you stop beating your wife questions, were so misguided because he was distorting the history of the conflict, in part by thinking the war began either in 2022 or even in 2014 with Crimea, and you kept pointing it out, actually the start of the war is 2013 with this change of government that he was shocked you called a coup, or even before with NATO expansion, even before it got to Ukraine. So talk about those parts of the history that the New York Times, the New Yorker editors didn't allow you to have included in that article, and why you think that history is so important to understanding how we're being propagandized about the conflict now.
Well, it's a little amazing to be the New Yorker of all places. Okay, maybe I shouldn't say of all places, but Remnick's New Yorker is absolutely neocon, beginning to end. The New York Times is completely neocon. I don't know if they would be, by the way, if I can't figure it out if it's just anti-Trump, pro-Biden, or they really believe the stuff that they say, but they're absolutely unwilling to listen or to learn a fact. The thing that surprised me about Chotiner was just how he knew nothing and kept making aggressive assertions. And when you tried to say something, it was just snark. So it was a really weird experience.
Well, he's playing to that audience that loves it. Like, they assume all of his assumptions that he's getting from the New York Times. That's the full extent of their worldview. You kept trying to inject an alternative historical understanding, but it never made it into the article, which is why I'd love for you to offer it now about the importance of 2013 and that change of government, and even kind of going back to when NATO started expanding after the reunification of Germany eastward toward the Soviet or toward Russia.
Well, I posted a piece on Common Dreams, which people can take a look at to get a lot of the hyperlinks and a lot of the underlying data and evidence. But this story really goes back 34 years. It goes back to 1989, 1990. The U.S. and Germany were both very clear to Gorbachev, who was a godsend for the world, by the way, because he really was a man of peace, and I was profoundly honored to try to help him on the economic side, though the White House was having none of it at the time. But in any event, Gorbachev believed in peace, and he unilaterally disbanded the Warsaw Pact, which was the Soviet side NATO, and Baker and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the German foreign minister, repeated time and again to Gorbachev, and in many, many different forms, and so did the NATO Secretary General and others, we will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. We won't do it. Now, I spoke to a wonderful historian who is working on this right now, who tells me that in the archives he's come across in 1992, not only the plans for NATO expansion, but Ukraine already on the list for NATO expansion in 1992, when supposedly in the public there is no such thing as NATO expansion at all. But remember 1992, that was Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld in the Bush senior administration. I thought, what could be worse? Well, we kept learning things can get worse.
Right.
Even in the Democratic Party, the love affair with the so-called liberal hegemony. I don't know what the liberal part is, but I know what the hegemony part is. That has been Nuland's thing, and of course her husband Robert Kagan's thing for decades. This has been underway since the early 1990s. Now, the Russians have been saying, and Gorbachev said, don't move eastward. We want peace. We want openness. I was actually advisor to Gorbachev. I was economic advisor to Yeltsin. I was economic advisor to Leonid Kuchma, first president of independent Ukraine. I've seen all of these people. You know what they wanted? They wanted normal life. They wanted to stop the Cold War. They did not want crazy things. They wanted normalcy. And we wouldn't give it. What we said, normalcy, yeah, that's U.S. hegemony. That's U.S. indispensable power. That's U.S. we do what we want anywhere we want when we want it. And that has been the story all along. And frankly, I couldn't imagine it at the time because I was watching with my own eyes as a young guy. Suddenly, the world had a chance for peace. And peace didn't mean U.S. global hegemony. Peace meant normal cooperation, but we couldn't accept the deal of just being normal and cooperative. We had to say, now we lead on everything. And that's been the story since the beginning. Now, there are many steps to it. Clinton was the first violator of the promises, and Clinton's so inconsistent on everything, but this is one of the things he was inconsistent on. So the first NATO expansion took place under Clinton, and that was Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. The next NATO expansion, 7 countries by Bush Jr. in 2004, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania and Bulgaria on the Black Sea. So you had the Baltic states, you had Romania and Bulgaria. You're starting to, right up against Russia, Slovakia and Slovenia. Now, Putin says in 2007, stop already, stop. He says it in a famous speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. We don't listen at all. 2008, Bush says NATO is going to enlarge to Ukraine. The European leaders, by the way, were aghast. And one of the European top leaders at the time called me, said, what is your president doing? Of course, European leaders don't say any of this publicly, but they say privately, this is crazy. This is so dangerous. But of course, they were quiet. Bush pushed this through in 2008. Then there was a reprieve for Ukraine. The reprieve was that the president, Viktor Yanukovych, said, look, we're in between two giants. We don't want to be smashed in the middle. We take neutrality. But neutrality was a red flag for Victoria Nuland and her friends. And so at the end of 2013, when demonstrations against the decision that Yanukovych had made to postpone signing an agreement with EU started protests, believe me, the U.S. covertly and overtly and every other way stirred that up massively. But in January and February 2014, they supported a violent insurrection that overthrew Yanukovych. And of course, notoriously, Nuland was caught on tape, something we don't talk about, but anyone go listen to it.
She picked the next leader. She picked the new leader.
She's planning the government weeks before the overthrow, calling exactly who would be the prime minister, by the way. It's amazing. But the whole thing is amnesia. Don't talk about any of this, though it's so obvious. And I had a weird experience personally, which was that when the government was overthrown and Yanukovych fled and Yatsenyuk was prime minister, just as Nuland said, I got a call. Yatsenyuk wants to meet you. It's a deep economic crisis. Okay, I actually respond to those things when a government says we're in a very deep financial crisis. So I flew to Kiev, and I had an NGO brag to me about the role they played in the overthrow, and it was ugly. It left me shaking. It was, the kind of thing you just want to wash that off. Don't tell me this awful stuff. You had no business being part of a violent insurrection. But that's the role we played. I went home. I didn't go back. I was disgusted by the whole thing. But it was obvious then we were on a path towards war. This didn't start with a, quote, unprovoked invasion February 24th, 22, excuse me. This started in February 2014, and it started with the U.S. participation in a coup. And I've dealt with already in my career with a number of presidents of Argentina, and they don't have the internal political capacity to overcome this yet. So all of this is to say, Argentina, endlessly fascinating, a little bit bizarre. Hopefully they'll get out of it this time. What's interesting now geopolitically is that the outgoing government had joined the BRICS. And that is a good thing and an important thing for Argentina, because it brings Argentina and the next door giant Brazil together, which is very good for South America, very important diplomatically, very important geopolitically. The incoming government has said, oh, we don't want to have anything to do with China because Milei is being portrayed as an ardent Americanist, so on the American side of this bloc politics. My message to the Argentines is, look, China's your major customer. Don't be dumb. Don't go with the U.S. in this sense. Trade with the U.S., trade with China. Don't get into this crazy mentality of one side or another. And by the way, in this world today, if you have to choose one side or another, I wouldn't go with the American side. Every time a country sides with the United States these days, it ends up in disaster, like Ukraine, because the U.S. is a fading empire. It can't sustain all its promises, not even close. It can't even keep its own public institutions functioning anymore. So my message to the Argentines is you don't have to choose sides. Just be nice, but don't break relations with China, for heaven's sake. Join the BRICS. It's a good thing to do. And maybe within the BRICS efforts this year, which are very important efforts to create non-dollar payments, there'll be something in it for Argentina. That I'm going to try to explain to them. There really is some good news for Argentina in the fact that it won't just be the dollar in the world, that there will be alternative payments, and Argentina shouldn't close itself off from what's going to be an important new force in international monetary economics.
That's all very interesting, because one of the things that I noticed, which has not been mentioned, I think, widely, is that Putin, of course, has just been to the UAE and he's just been to the Saudi Arabia, and he came with a very, very big and very strong delegation of people. And I noticed that one of the people who was there was, of course, Nabulina, who is the central bank chair. And both Saudi Arabia...
I didn't realize she was on the trip, but that is a very interesting part.
It was interesting because I don't think it was announced, but there was a list of, you saw the picture of all the people in Riyadh, and they were all shaking hands. And one of the people who was there and who shook the hands was none other than Nabulina. So she was there. And of course, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are both joining the BRICS in a few weeks. So is Iran. The Iranian president has just been to Moscow. He's had discussions there with Putin. There's just been this announcement of this free trade agreement. And then at the same time, Putin gave this speech at an investment forum run by VTB. And a disproportionate amount of that discussion was about the financial architecture. He was saying that, in fact, that seemed to be the most important thing, that, you need to get the financial architecture right domestically in order to move forward. But he was also talking about the new financial architecture. And he said some very interesting things about how the existing financial architecture, which is Western-based, is becoming outdated and obsolescent, also in a technological sense. So you have Nabulina there in all of these meetings, and she's presumably talking about all of these matters. She seems to be very interested in them. And she's talking with the big oil producers. And Iran is also a big oil producer. And at the same time, you have all these discussions from Putin about financial systems. And I wonder whether this adds up.
Yeah, the trip was absolutely fascinating, incredibly skillful of Putin at this moment. And it reflects actually three major geopolitical points, all, I think, rather ingeniously brought together. One of them is OPEC Plus, of course. OPEC plus Russia constitutes an enormous part of the hydrocarbons market of the world, and they do a lot of important business together in this, in managing the oil and gas market. So that's one part of the trip. Another part of the trip is clearly regional, which is the integration of Russia with Central Asia, with the Arabian Peninsula, with the Middle East more generally. And you look at the map, and between Russia, China, Central Asia, Arabia, this is building, and of course, India is a member of the BRICS. This is really building most of Eurasia into an integrated geopolitical and economic huge part of the world. And so very, very deft in that regard also. A basic principle of economics, a fundamental principle, is neighbors should get along. They trade well with each other. They share ecosystems with each other. And that's the principle that Putin is following because Iran is a neighbor. The Middle East is a neighbor. This is very smart. And then the third dimension, in addition to the oil and the neighborhood, is, of course, the BRICS. And the BRICS started out as the five: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It had already reached an output level measured at what we call purchasing power prices or at international prices larger than the G7. That is geopolitically and economically notable. But now the five are being joined by six more, presumably. Argentina, that's the new addition in South America. Egypt and Ethiopia in Africa, and Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Iran in the Middle East region. Now, you add the six to the original five, you have 37% of world output, according to the IMF purchasing power data, compared to 29 to 30% for the G7. This is a different world, and this is really powerful. And what the BRICS are discussing this year in particular is exactly this financial architecture. And of course, that was greatly hastened by the absolutely awful and mistaken US policies on the dollar. So the US has what Charles de Gaulle, already President de Gaulle, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, called the exorbitant privilege, which is that the dollar is used for about 60% of international transactions of all kinds. The way you denominate a contract, the way you pay to settle a contract, the way governments hold their foreign exchange reserves. So on all three major dimensions of international currency, the dollar predominates. Not exclusively, but overwhelming. And that gives the US a huge advantage. You don't run out of the dollar to what? To the dollar. And so it's not like Argentina where everyone's sitting on the edge as the US debt reaches 100% of GDP. If Argentine debt ever came close to 100% of GDP, they'd be out the door in a moment. But with the US being the currency of the world, nobody flees the dollar. So that's the exorbitant privilege that you get to borrow. You can pump up the money supply. You get some inflation, but you don't get what Argentina or just about any other emerging economy would get. But the US just couldn't leave good enough alone. It had to weaponize the dollar. And this has really been, it's become an addiction. The US generally is addicted to regime change. The US generally is addicted to a foreign policy that says, I don't like you, I want to replace you. Send in the CIA or send in an army, but we get to choose who your government is. Now, this is absolutely disastrous foreign policy, in my view, completely against the UN Charter, completely against international law, but that's the core. And the US figured out 10 or 15 years ago that it could use the dollar as a foreign policy weapon. And the main way that it uses it is in a very crude way, which is to say, one day, your dollars are now our dollars, thank you. Your dollars literally means you have accounts in US banks or US controlled banks. That's what a dollar is in effect, M2 definition of a dollar. So you're holding dollar accounts in institutions that we control. And what the US has come to do increasingly frequently is freeze the money of other countries, of their central banks, no less, of their state enterprises. And the United States did this with Venezuela. Absolutely absurd, but one day Trump and his minions got the idea that they will declare who's the real president of Venezuela, not the actual president of Venezuela, but they named someone from the Venezuelan parliament as president and said, okay, that guy's president. That actually lasted for a few years. And you could see the power of the United States. It's like the emperor with no clothes. About 40 countries said, oh, now Mr. Guaido is president, not Mr. Maduro, who's actually president. So you could see a measure of the U.S. influence that other countries would follow this nonsense. But in the process, they said, Mr. Maduro's no longer president, because we said so, and he no longer has access to the foreign exchange reserves of the country. We give that to this other one. Well, this is absolutely crazy. Even the IMF couldn't, I shouldn't say even the IMF. The IMF couldn't figure this out. It doesn't have the gumption to say to the United States, that's ridiculous. So, oh, no, we have a big issue. Who really controls the foreign exchange reserves? So these games went on for years. Of course, with Russia, it's much more serious than that. The United States froze its estimated $300 billion of Russian financial assets. That's a lot of money, by the way. That was the trick that was going to bring Russia to its knees. It didn't do so. But that's what they thought. We've got Putin cornered. We've got Russia cornered. We'll bring them to their knees by freezing their assets and locking them out of the U.S. banking system, the so-called SWIFT settlement system. Well, Russia quickly figured out, very cleverly, we could trade with China and renminbi. We could trade with India and rupees, a little bit shakier on that front. We can find other ways to transact. And to make maybe a short story long as I have, this year, Russia is the leader of the BRICS. The BRICS summit will be in Kazan next October, I believe it is. And so Russia chairs the process, and it's chairing an expert group to come up with non-dollar payments. This is smart. And I kept telling my friends in the US government, don't abuse the dollar. It's going to go away. Because in monetary economics, the first thing you teach is the real economy is the real thing, what you produce, what the factories are. There are many ways to make a settlement, even barter, of course, but there are many currencies you can use. So don't think that your currency brings another country to its knees, because the other country's economy is the real economy, the ability to produce steel, the ability to produce weapons or artillery, the ability to produce automobiles or chips or whatever it is, or oil. And the United States misunderstood that, but really abused the privilege of the dollar. And the dollar will absolutely lose its role in centrality in the international payment system in the coming decade. In monetary economics, just to mention, all my colleagues look at history and say it's a long, slow decline of a currency. And the most famous case is the British pound, which used to be the core of the international monetary and financial system in the 19th century until basically the Great Depression. But the fact is, and so they say, look, the pound hung in there even after Germany was larger, even after the United States was larger, even after Britain's share of the world economy had declined. London remained the center of the international system. But it's not going to happen the same way with the dollar, because it's just too easy technologically to do things differently. And so we will have at least an international renminbi at a minimum playing a big role. And we could have a kind of BRICS, if not central bank, a BRICS monetary fund that serves the role of giving liquidity and credits among the BRICS countries in a way which will mean a non-dollar settlement system.
Professor Sachs, just a few things. As a person in Britain, I can say that the long decline of sterling after Britain lost its hegemonic position in the world economy was an absolute disaster for Britain. You would not want to go through that process again.
And by the way, it's quite interesting just to say the way it manifested, of course, World War I was awful. The return to gold in 1926 overvalued Britain in the world economy. And Keynes wrote one of his most famous essays in 1926 called The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, who happened to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1926, that put this mistake into place. The 1930s were the Great Depression. World War II, of course, devastating. And the point is, by the end of World War II, Britain had basically gone deeply into debt, even with its own colonies, which became independent countries. And so Britain never quite got out of debtor status again. And it was a very, very heavy, long, painful period. Britain, the center of the world, going to the new International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan. I mean, unthinkable. But, the United States, can you imagine going to the IMF for a loan? It's not impossible. This is exactly what you're referring to.
Absolutely. I remember it. I was in London, of course, when it happened. I can remember the Chancellor turning back at the airport, which he had to rush off to Washington to raise funds. And of course, the fact that we had this currency, which was still an international currency, was doing immense damage to the British domestic economy, which I think people don't understand. So in some ways, it might actually be better for the United States, I would have thought, to go through it quickly than have it, drawn out in the way that it was with Britain. I'm not, by the way, saying that's going to happen, and I'm not making those points. But anyway, that's what I wanted to say. If it's a long process, it's a long agony. It's not based on the British experience.
So, we will have non-dollar payments in the BRICS. That's clearly high on the mind, not only of President Putin, obviously, but also President Lula, who every day asks, and he's the chair of the G20 this year, as well as being a BRICS member, why are we dealing with Russia in dollars, for heaven's sake? And he's very sensible, very logical, and we will move to new payments arrangements, and they will do just fine, thank you. That will be the real lesson. I tried to get a piece in the New York Times recently. They actually accepted it, then they rejected it. I was trying to explain that there were provocations to this war, because they have used the word unprovoked about the Russian invasion 26 times by my count. They've done it in their editorials. They've done it in the New York Times columns like Tom Friedman and others, and they've done it in the invited op-ed pieces. So I said to the editors, come on, could you run something that says that there was provocation? Just let me write a few hundred words to put it on the other side. And first the editor said, yeah, we'll accept that. I actually sent in a piece and he edited it, and then they said, no, we're not going to run this thing. So it's very hard right now to have a real discussion in the major mainstream, I'd say, pro-Biden media. I think the New York Times, if it was probably against the prevailing administration, would be more critical. I don't think it's just pure dumbing down. I think it's politics. They like Biden, so they don't want to say anything against the Biden administration. And if the Biden administration is part of this war effort, they don't want to talk about it. I think that's really what it is. It's just a kind of pure partisanship, so that they feel, oh, we don't want Trump back, so we're not going to say anything bad about Biden. So, and our readers, they must think, aren't grown up enough to be able to discern any subtleties in this. It's bad, actually. It's very strange.
It is strange.
I'll tell you, my own view. This is another issue, but I'm a pretty good observer, and I talk to a lot of people. And my own view, just to shift topics for a moment, is that the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, and I explained why I thought so from the start. Then came along Seymour Hersh, who I have to admit is a hero of mine, lifetime hero, because I grew up as a young kid reading his accounts of Vietnam War atrocities and so forth. So I've always loved Seymour, but he gave a very detailed explanation of what happened, the timing, how it was done, and so forth. You know, the New York Times didn't even cover that, didn't even cover it to debunk it. And then there was this almost like a joke. I think it was a joke on the New York Times, actually. They got some, somebody from the CIA or someplace or the White House told them it was some people in a yacht. It was 6 people in a boat. That story lasted about 24 hours. I mean, it didn't even last 2 minutes in my view. I thought it was hilarious, not substantive. But the New York Times ran it with a straight face, but they wouldn't run Seymour Hersh's account and then discuss it. So they're not even covering the news and much less challenging a critical thought. And that,
yes, I would
that's
agree.
Pretty serious.
The New York Times, the Washington Post, and their coverage of what's happening in Ukraine have really assigned themselves to irrelevancy because they are Pentagon PR flacks who just repeat talking points. And there's no serious investigation into any aspect of this war. And that's why, at Code Pink, we support alternative, non-corporate journalism. Please tell others. Code Pink Radio will tell you the truth. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, let's talk about China a little bit further. Yep. China has come out with the 12-point peace proposal, which Biden immediately dismissed as, what did he say? He said it was irrational. Frankly, his response was irrational. Meanwhile, we've had actual Code Pink members have met with representatives of China in Washington, D.C. to thank the Chinese government for coming up with this peace plan and for playing a peacemaker's role. I mean, whatever people think about China and whatever criticisms they have, I think we have to be very clear that China, as you mentioned, has maybe 1 or 2 overseas bases. It's not a threat militarily, and it is trying to play the role of peacemaker, not just in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine. Do you think that China, the global South, can make a difference here? I mean, because it's not just China, it's Mexico, it's Brazil, it's other countries too that are saying we need a ceasefire. We need it now because they know the security of not just Ukraine and Russia and the United States is at stake, but the security of the entire globe.
First, I think people should understand a basic fact about China. China has not engaged in one overseas war in the last 40 years, while the United States has been engaged in non-stop wars. We keep pointing our finger at China. Look at how militaristic. We vastly outspend China on the military. We have surrounded China with military bases. We've been engaged in constant wars. We are trying right now to break the Chinese economy. And then we point our finger like the G7 did in this recent meeting in just a kind of a hate-filled, ignorant session. Look at how evil China is. Look at how evil China is. It's so low level for anyone who really follows this. I was actually myself in China last month. I've been to China so many times over the last 40 years. We're in a propaganda field right now of anti-China propaganda that has no basis in reality. And we're trying to create an enemy there so we can crush China because they're daring to achieve economic development. So this is the starting point. Now, in terms of China's peace plan, it has one crucial point. And it says that a peace agreement should respect the security interests of all parties. What does that mean? That's code for don't expand NATO, because Russia, understandably, regards that as a direct security threat. To have NATO weapons on Russia's 1,900-kilometer border with Ukraine is not what Russia would like. Just like we would not be thrilled with Russian bases in Mexico or in Canada or any place else nearby. That's what Russia's trying to tell us. China gets it. China just uses very Confucian, if I could say, very nice, orderly words, respect the security interests of all parties. And that means to the United States, would you understand what Russia has been saying to the US since Russia was independent, December 1991? Don't enlarge NATO. And especially since 2008, by God, not to Georgia. Are you kidding? That's what they've been telling us. And China gets it. And that's why Biden immediately rejected it. Because this is a game. The game is Nuland's game to expand NATO to Ukraine.
You know, I think a lot of people don't realize, Jeffrey Sachs, that this has been a long time coming, not just in terms of, beginning in 2004 with the greatest expansion of NATO, but also in 2020, we had NATO recognize Ukraine as what I call a de facto member with this interoperability agreement saying, we're going to integrate our armed forces. Now, what's the difference between being a de facto member of NATO and an official member of NATO? Well, it could be what you're talking about, bases. It could be nuclear weapons. People say, well, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. First of all, they should all give them up, right? We should be pushing for the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which NATO emphatically opposes. So NATO,
and by the way, if I may just,
weapons.
if I may just say that under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which we are a major signatory, we are bound to nuclear disarmament, but we're not even trying right now. So we're not even honoring the treaties that we're in, much less joining the treaties that we ought to be joining. So this is a terrible thing. And by the way, that's a huge budget cost. That is hundreds of billions of dollars that we're spending on, quote, modernizing the nuclear weapons rather than negotiating nuclear disarmament. So that's another part to come back to the budget story of the past. But this story of NATO goes back actually to the early 1990s. I spoke with a wonderful historian recently who told me that in documents that he is reviewing, he hasn't published yet, Ukraine was already on a list for NATO enlargement in 1992. Now, that's, years before Putin's anywhere around on this. This is a plan that goes back to the neocons with Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld in the Bush administration. So this goes back, and now, interestingly, if you look up, it's a fascinating article. Zbig Brzezinski in 1997 in Foreign Affairs magazine. Mind you, this is before Putin's president by years. In 1997, Zbig Brzezinski spells out the timeline for expanding NATO to Ukraine. And he says almost exactly the sequence as it actually happened, because what he was writing in 1997 was not just his ideas, he was writing what was already in the works inside the government. So this is a story that goes back 25 years at least, and it's been hidden from the American people. And they thought they'd get it on a bluff. The real idea of the United States was, what's Putin going to do? We're going to expand NATO, and what's he going to do? And he's going to complain, and we're going to say it's none of your business, and we're going to expand. And that was really their idea. Then Yanukovych got in the way. Yanukovych, president of Ukraine, who said, no, I don't want Ukraine to be in NATO. That's very dangerous. We'll be neutral. Well, the U.S. helped get rid of him. So this is a long, long story. None of it told honestly to the American people. And then if you say it now that this had something to do with the war, try to get it published in the New York Times. You can't.
Jeffrey, people say, I've heard this over and over again, and they quote different people, unnamed people, I won't give them the credit here. They say, look, the reason why Putin has not invaded Poland, let's say, is because Poland is a member of NATO. So Ukraine needs this protection. If Ukraine were a member, an official, not just a de facto or interoperability member of NATO, then Putin never would have invaded.
That's possible. But you know what? The way we did it, we virtually guaranteed a war. Period. In other words, to say, okay, Ukraine, yeah, you're going to join NATO, and the Russians are saying against our border, no. And then letting, as this occurred, they said, you keep pushing this, we're going to have war. And the war started in 2014 because the safety for Ukraine was when Ukraine was saying, we don't even want it, stop, don't get us into the middle of this war between the two of you. So the fact of the matter is this, NATO enlargement was completely unnecessary and provocative all the way back to the 1990s.
And then we saw in 2019,
but just
Ukraine
to say,
embedded in its constitution this vow to join NATO.
Just to say, even the first round, which was Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, the Russians hated it, but it didn't cause a war. That's far from their borders. Then the next round came, and the Russians were really, really annoyed because that one was on their border with the Baltics. So it was Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And then they said, oh, come on, will you stop? Then in 2007, Putin said, okay, you've done it. You keep expanding NATO. You promised you wouldn't, but you keep doing it. Stop. Do not come up to our border with Ukraine and Georgia. And by the way, people should take a map out and understand a little bit about this. The real goal of these neocons, the Nuland neocons, is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. This is why, where does Georgia come in here? I don't mean Atlanta, Georgia. I mean Georgia, the country in the Caucasus. Where's that come from? If you look at a map, the idea of these neocons is that you have Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. And Putin saying, don't do this, stop. And he says this in 2007. Then in 2008, Bush pushes this, and Nuland is key member of the administration then. And they push this over the opposition of the Europeans and get the Bucharest NATO declaration to declare that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, will. And by the way, Biden has been part of this all along. And the military-industrial complex has pushed this. The literal lobbies for NATO enlargement have been Raytheon people. I mean, you can't make this up. This is how the U.S. government works.
Lastly,
Raytheon.
Jeffrey Sachs,
Yes.
I want to ask you about Ukraine and the future of Ukraine. Should we continue on this calamitous path of endless war, propping up the Ukrainian government to the tune of $6 billion a month, spending over $115 billion to continue the war, half of that going to military contractors for weapons and military training. Meanwhile, what's going to happen to the Ukrainian economy? Because we've already read about Zelensky privatizing a lot of these industries that were nationalized under the Soviet Union. And we know that BlackRock, representatives of BlackRock have been over in Ukraine. And we know that Zelensky has a website. And on the website, there's a menu for privatizing Ukraine and inviting investors to, yes, invest in the military in Ukraine. Where do you see this going? Should we continue on this course?
Look, Ukraine is being destroyed. This is the first tragedy is for Ukraine itself. Being a place where the U.S. wages a proxy war is the worst place you can be. As Kissinger famously said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend can be fatal. We are killing Ukraine. Literally, we're killing Ukrainians, but we're killing Ukraine. Think of how we loved Afghanistan, how we love South Vietnam. What do we do? Iraq. If you are the place where the US is waging a proxy war, first of all, you will be physically destroyed. You will have mass outmigration of young people, of talented people, of people just trying to survive, for God's sake. You'll have your infrastructure destroyed. All of this, the Ukrainian economy is busted, and the Ukrainian population has shrunk tremendously because people have left the country. And so this is in no way helping Ukraine. This is just, I tried to tell the Ukrainians, I'm for you. I'm not against you. They kept thinking, oh, that's Putin propaganda. I said, no, listen, I go back to the Vietnam War in the United States, to Iraq, Afghanistan. I've seen what happens when the US grabs you in a proxy war. And this is what's happening right now to Ukraine. It's being tragically destroyed. And every time things don't work, our side ratchets up, and they keep ratcheting up. And sad to say, Obama knew in 2014, he got the main point when he said and realized that Russia has what's called escalatory dominance. What that means is Russia can meet us and raise the bet. Because for Russia, this is existential. For us, it's another war. Okay, we're going to expand NATO here. We're going to expand NATO there. We're going to do whatever we want to do. For Russia, they view this as the essence of Russia's national security. They have 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons. Obama realized this, said, I don't want to even start down this path. I don't know what this administration is doing. They have no plan. It's phony. And phony in the sense that they have no route to success, but they're in it up to their necks right now. Worse than that, for Ukraine, they're in it above their heads. They're drowning in this violence. We've got to stop the fighting, because there is no military path to victory, because Russia can escalate, and can escalate to devastation. And we're told, oh, don't say that, don't mention nuclear weapons and so forth. You know what? Mention them. Understand.
Yes, and I think
I
think we should also mention, Jeffrey Sachs, that the United States has a nuclear posture review. The Biden administration says we will use nuclear weapons first if our allies' interests are threatened. So, who's going to use them first, or will they be used? All of this is speculation, but it's frightening that we are escalating right now, training Ukrainians on F-16 fighter jets that could
after they said again
Russia.
And again that they wouldn't do it, they keep taking the next step. It's time for the Nuland administration really to step down so that we can have peace and have some sanity. But the inflation rate is reaching 100% per year right now. Argentina, the inflation rate is reaching 100%. There will be other countries experiencing this kind of runaway inflation. Maybe Ukraine is going to have a hyperinflation by the end of this crisis. Of course, we don't know.
But unlike 30 years ago or 40 years ago, actually, well, almost 50 to be exact, is the developed world, are the developed economies and their financial system insulated from this impact that could be coming again from emerging markets or developing economies?
It's interesting, of course, in the 2010s, because the European Central Bank did not do a very good job under its President Trichet in the early years of the last decade. Greece nearly went bankrupt. And it wasn't so far for Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and even Italy.
And Slovenia.
So the Eurozone and Slovenia, the Eurozone almost collapsed. It required Draghi's deft hand to prevent that collapse. Basically, the European Central Bank had to act as a lender of last resort to prevent a disaster. So central banks and their wisdom or lack of wisdom will determine a lot. In 2008, the Fed and the U.S. Treasury stupidly drove Lehman Brothers into a bankruptcy one weekend in September 2008, and it cost the whole world trillions of dollars, that technical mistake that they made. And so when you're in a crisis, the first thing to say is these institutions are not so reliable. They're not so smart. They're not so foolproof that they necessarily avoid real damage. What we need to come to the positive answer to your question is we need to avoid a contagion of defaults and a contagion of insolvencies. And we also need to avoid simply telling dozens of countries, you need to contract sharply your public investment and your social spending and so forth.
So you effectively coming full circle from what, being the sort of from professing shock therapies, you are coming full circle into actually going against these sort of fiscal cuts in the country.
No. Remember, when I was advocating shock therapy, I was advocating that governments not print money or issue money in order to finance budget deficits. But I was constantly recommending that the international finance help the countries to avoid defaults or crises. One of the key pillars of shock therapy in Bolivia and Poland, for example, was a cancellation of the debts of those countries, the foreign debts. So I argued that to pay the foreign debts in Bolivia would have condemned the country to a rampant hyperinflation. And in the end, Bolivia's external debt to international banks was cut by about 90% at my recommendation. Similarly, in Poland, in that shock therapy, I recommended that Poland's debt overhang should be relieved. The debt that Poland owed, especially to its official creditors, should be cut very, very sharply, and that indeed happened. So I did not recommend simply austerity and contraction. I recommended always that the international counterparts, the creditors, play a role, a constructive role, a positive role in preventing crisis in the debtor countries.
And in debt relief, regardless the potential risk of moral hazard
debt relief depends on the circumstances. In the circumstances today, I'm not recommending cancellation of the face value of debts. What I am recommending is that one way or another, and it depends very much on the specific circumstances, that countries get the kinds of development finance that they need, even on a larger scale than now. And I'm talking about new debts on a long-term, low-interest rate basis so that these countries can continue to develop without going into default today. It's a tricky proposition for countries that have borrowed on the Eurobond market, governments that owe money right now. It may be that they have to say to the creditors, well, we need to extend the horizon for repayment under certain kinds of contracts where there are collective action clauses. This can be done fairly smoothly, and probably many countries are going to have to take that chance. When it comes to official credits that a government owes to a rich country government or to the World Bank or to some other international institution, I'm recommending a set of measures to make sure that the developing countries are getting more finance in fresh form than they are repaying on old debts. There are many ways to do that, but I'm basically saying don't print money. I've never believed in that because you just get high inflation, but rather let's get a financial solution that doesn't condemn the country to default or to bankruptcy or to extreme austerity. That's actually always been my policy recommendation since I started this approach in Bolivia in 1985.
And is it achievable under the current circumstances when the US Fed is fighting a 40-year high inflation and has been pushing up interest rates higher to the unprecedented high for, let's say, several decades going back, because that's actually been increasing the debt load or debt gearing of and debt servicing costs for all the EMs or developing countries?
It's going to be a close call for several reasons, but let me put it this way. Currently, the 30-year bond rate of the U.S. Treasury is about 3.2%, still quite low. The 30-year bond rate for German debt is still around 1%, actually. The 30-year bond rate for Ghana or for an emerging economy, if they can get a 30-year loan, is 10%. In other words, I am advocating a significant increase of official financing at interest rates that the Treasury or the German government or other Eurozone countries pay themselves. The real room for maneuver is that the interest rates paid by the high-income countries are still very low compared to what the emerging market economies face. What I'm suggesting, therefore, is a major expansion of funds coming from the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, that essentially can borrow on terms very close to what the US government or German government or Japanese government can borrow at, and therefore lend at quite low and long-term interest rates to emerging markets that, if they are left on their own, face horrendous terms that would drive them into default.
And then we are back into the whole idea of the currently lack of cooperation will on the global level. We have to get back to
there you go. So I'm recommending to the G20 this approach, but is there a G20 even right now? Countries are barely talking to each other. The US and Russia literally are not talking to each other, of course. US and China barely talking to each other and cooperating on something as bold as avoiding a financial crisis. Somehow it's not going well. And for me, all through my career, even when I didn't understand it properly at the time, it has been determined by geopolitics. Will something work or won't it work? Because you need cooperation. If the cooperative environment is there, a lot can get done. If there is no cooperation, the chance for a contagion is very, very real. This, I think, is what we face right now.
I have a last question on this topic. The ECB is facing a real difficult times and dilemma. Even, I mean, it's behind the tightening curve, launched by the Fed earlier in the season. What can ECB do to actually, put its policies back straight on the right course of sustaining that kind of development and preventing any global financial crisis, or maybe world financial crisis number 2 following 2008, 2009?
Well, I think Europe is in an extremely difficult situation, not mainly because of the ECB, but mainly because of the war in Ukraine and the vulnerability on energy, obviously. Europe's already in a downturn. It could get quite severe in the coming months. My position on this is not popular in Europe. among the politicians. But as I've emphasized, my position is that there is a negotiated way out of this. I don't believe the NATO line that, well, we're just going to fight till we defeat Putin. If that is the approach, I don't think it's going to succeed on the battlefield. And I also think that the consequences economically will become quite unmanageable. The crisis will be very serious in my view. Now, maybe I'm too pessimistic, but I believe that the energy crisis and all of the uncertainties around it and all of the other ramifications, and you compound that with the growing break with China as well, I think it will lead to a very significant crisis in Europe. And since we see the politics are already quite unstable in a number of countries, including Italy, for example, where the Draghi government has just fallen, and who knows what will happen next with elections coming up. I think that the chance of revisiting a deep Eurozone crisis becomes very real. So I don't see the pieces working very well right now. And the ECB can only do so much in this context. I think it's going to have an extremely difficult time unless we find a way to peace and to easing the very, very high tensions right now.
You are viewed, and correct me if I'm wrong, as the co-author or co-father of the United Nations development goals that are used in the currently, often discussed ESG policies. And you are the Columbia University Director of the Center for Sustainable Development. And what does it mean? What is your typical day like in this role?
Great question. Typically, it's Zooming from early morning till late at night, because now in our digital world, we can meet and speak all over the world rather conveniently.
And do it sustainably.
And do it, depending on how exactly the electricity is provided for our Zooms, that remains a question. But it's much more sustainable than getting on an airplane for every meeting that one has to have. I spend a tremendous amount of my day, every day, working on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. I believe, as I've been emphasizing, that global cooperation is necessary, is vital, and is feasible. I don't believe in a divided world. I don't believe in democracies versus autocracies. I don't believe in cold wars or hot wars. I believe that our environmental and social crises are so severe that we need cooperation right now above all of the differences that we might suppose to divide the world. And so I speak with the Chinese, I speak with Latin America, African leaders, European leaders, all the time. And I promote solutions, as we discussed, for the financial crisis, which is deepening, for the climate crisis, which is deepening. And I help to lead a network of more than 1,500 universities around the world to address, through education and research and policy analysis, how to promote sustainable development. And war is my enemy, obviously, because it's the biggest distraction. It sucks up all the energy. It destroys so much faster than we can possibly build. It undermines every opportunity for trust and partnership. So these days I spend a tremendous amount of time trying to see, is there some way to overcome this two-front crisis that we face with Russia and China against the U.S. And its alliance. And I always appeal for Europe to be smarter in its diplomacy, because Europe has the values of sustainable development, yet it's caught in war. And I want to see Europe get out of this trap of war, not fall into a trap of a new battle with China, and help lead the way to a cooperative approach to sustainable development.
Mm-hmm. How do you see the latest efforts by US and EU authorities in sort of codifying the ESG rules? How do you see the current approach to that? Whether it should be sort of more better codified from the above rather than sort of driven from below by the markets?
It definitely, we need top-down codification and top-down policies. And very broadly speaking, the European Green Deal is a valid, smart, I would say sophisticated approach. It's got many limitations, but the European Green Deal is a framework that the 27 have adopted. It can serve as a roadmap. It's not exactly a plan, of course, and there are 1,000 details to be argued every day. Is natural gas really green? Is nuclear green? And so on. So these are inevitable points of debate. But broadly speaking, the European Green Deal is well done and well worth achieving, and well worth promoting diplomatically, to say to the Latin American countries, to the African Union, to ASEAN, and so on, you need a Green Deal the same way we have a Green Deal. Europe could really provide a lot of leadership that way.
When it comes to the Green Deal taxonomy, what's really important for the Czech Republic and even some other Central European countries, do you think that the nuclear power should be viewed as sustainable going forward, and that Germany should actually bring its, sort of reverse its policy of shutting down nuclear power plants?
I think nuclear power, if, and this is a big if it can be managed safely, so that with the absolute state-of-the-art safety systems, especially passive safety systems, offers a component of the zero carbon energy system. I don't believe, I'm not myself a purist that says absolutely no to nuclear power. Of course, it raises many issues. Fissile materials, nuclear safety, nuclear waste, and the alternatives, because if you could do it without nuclear through an efficient system of wind, solar, hydro, and so forth, there's a lot of merit to that. But I think within the practical context, there's no doubt that nuclear power is going to continue to play its role, obviously in France, obviously in Central Europe, obviously in China, in Korea, in
Ukraine,
a lot of
in
countries
Russia.
in the world. Well, in Russia and Ukraine, I would expect so also, absolutely.
The discovery of how to mobilize wind and water power already 2.5 to 3 millennia ago. Of course, the breakthrough with fossil fuel, with the steam engine in the 18th century, with the electric dynamo in the 19th century, nuclear age, and so forth. So all of this is to say we are very much paced by large technological changes. The dominant technological changes of our day came out of the wonderful imagination of Alan Turing and John von Neumann, and the architects of the digital world with the transistors and integrated circuits. And this is a deep transformation that is propelling us today. So in good classical Enlightenment form, I approach this as a stadial theory of change, meaning you make stages I designate 7 stages. I won't go through them in this brief period, but each is paced by major technological change, which gives rise to political change. It creates city-states, or nations, or empires, or transoceanic empires. And we are in another phase of fundamental political change. So just a word about the geography of long-term development. An unbelievable amount of economic development takes place between these narrow latitudes because they are favored with the lucky fortune of a band of east-west geography of temperate and semi-arid zone steppelands and temperate agriculture, which encompassed typically 70 or 80% of the world population, and almost all of the technological changes in history, and the major empires line up incredibly along this line throughout history. So in most of human history, Asia was, from as far back as we know it, the most populated part of the world, 65 to 70% of world population. China and India have been giants in population for 2 millennia at least. And for most of that time, per capita income didn't vary so much as we know, and I'm using Angus Madison's famous estimates here. It meant that the shares of output more or less tracked the shares of population, with the modest variation for different periods, like the Song Dynasty being a particularly prosperous period in China, for example. But aside from the ups and downs, Asia was the center of gravity of the world system. Then, of course, this began to change very gradually after the beginning of the 16th century, in the so-called Age of Discovery or Age of Conquest, and it really took off after the end of the 18th century because of the steam engine, fundamentally, the era of industrialization. And since that came to England first, England used that to conquer much of the world. Just to say, as everybody knows, it is the great accident of history that Europe became the first to industrialize and to conquer Asia, because it was absolutely far more likely, I'd say something like 10-1 in favor of China in the 15th century, that it would go the other way. China was very close to discovering the sea routes to Europe and even possibly to the Americas across the northern Pacific. But in 1434, the single worst economic policy mistake in human history was made when the mandarins at the Ming court scrapped the Chinese fleet and just ended what was the mega age of discovery and oceanic transport of the giant fleets of Admiral Zheng He. Absolutely no deep reason for it. It was a catastrophic mistake. The next time the sea routes were opened between Europe and Asia was Europeans going to conquer Asia, not Asians going to explore and trade with Europe. So Columbus and Vasco da Gama. And my favorite lines from The Wealth of Nations, which is a remarkably wonderful and humane book, as well as a brilliant treatise. But my favorite part is this. Adam Smith says, the discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope, that's 1498 and 1492, are the 2 greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. Big statement, not bad. Connecting the whole world by these 2 oceanic voyages. Their consequences have already been very great, but in the short period of between 2 and 3 centuries, because Smith is writing in 1776, which has elapsed since these discoveries were made, it is impossible that the whole extent of their consequences can have been seen. And then what's wonderful about Smith in the Scottish Enlightenment is he points out that while this was generally a beneficial fact to unite the world, it was disastrous for the native inhabitants of the East and West Indies, he says. because he says that they were relatively weak at the time. He didn't understand that they also brought pathogens of the old world to the Americas that wiped out the population. So Smith could not have understood that, but he did understand conquest. And he said something incredibly humane at the end, which I think marks him as one of the great thinkers of modern times. He said, hereafter, perhaps, the natives of those countries may grow stronger, or those of Europe may grow weaker, and the inhabitants of all the different quarters of the world may arrive at that equality of courage and force, which by inspiring mutual fear can alone overawe the injustice of independent nations into some sort of respect for the rights of one another. But nothing seems more likely to establish this equality of force than that mutual communication of knowledge and of all sorts of improvements which an extensive commerce from all countries to all countries naturally, or rather necessarily, carries along with it. So what Smith is saying is, in the future, there's going to come an equality because trade is going to carry knowledge, technological improvement, and an equality of force. Basically, we are 250 years after Smith's writing, and that prediction has come true now. So Smith was in the middle of a 500-year period. 500 years ago, Asia in the lead and the center of gravity and in the technological lead. Europe becomes the agent of change. The steam engine, a reflection of that, not something that came out of the blue, but came out of Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton and empire. But it came out of a Glasgow workshop, the condenser on James Watt's steam engine. And there came a new European and North Atlantic-led world. But as Adam Smith said, eventually trade will rebalance, and that's the convergence that we're seeing now. So Watt's steam engine, historians are right to say that what was so fundamental about the steam engine is that it broke the organic barrier of the traditional economy, because basically almost all energy of the primary energy of the pre-James Watt economy was organic. What you could feed to human beings for their labor and what you could feed to the animals for animal traction, plus a little bit of wind and a little bit of water. But basically an organic economy, and we moved to a fossil fuel economy, and that let loose the ability to do work of an unimaginable scale. So everything changed with the fossil fuel breakthrough in the last 2.5 centuries. And of course, Europe got there first, and Britain got there first of the first. And in the geopolitics, we ended up with the British world. This is a map of a wonderful book, The Countries Never Invaded by Britain. Those are the ones in white. Britain went out and just beat the shit out of everybody. And really nasty, by the way. Nasty. In 1839, showed up in China and saying, you have to import our opium. No, we don't want your opium. You don't want our opium? We'll beat the hell out of you. That was the first Opium War. It was followed by the second Opium War. No scruples at all. Sorry to say. So that's power. That's the power of one-sided industrialization. And it conquered much of the world. Long story, and I won't go into it, but the baton was passed to the younger Anglo-American kid brother in 1945, the great Anglo-Saxon handoff, and the US became the next empire. And the idea was that we would dot the world with 800 military bases around the world, and Henry Luce made the sweetest love song to American leaders, telling them this is the American century. That is always captivating. It was captivating to Genghis Khan, it was captivating to Lord Palmerston, and it has been captivating to American leaders since then also, to believe this is your century in the world. It's over, but we still have 800 military bases around the world. I believe the Ukraine war is likely to be America's Teutoburg Forest defeat Teutoburg Forest was the loss by Augustus Octavian in AD 9, when the Roman Empire tried to cross the Rhine to the east to take over Germania and was defeated. It didn't end the Roman Empire. It just told them, this is a limit, and you're not going beyond that limit. And the United States is going to learn a limit that NATO doesn't just expand at US will. There are limits to that, and that's the painful process that we're in right now. But it's a secret. Don't tell anyone outside. You're likely to be canceled if you do. So the world changed fundamentally after the Second World War. The United States aspired to be the world leader, but something else happened to bring Adam Smith's forecast to reality, and that was the end of the imperial age. If there is one dimension of imperialism that I think needs to be understood, it is that imperial powers do not educate the natives. And if there's one dimension of economic development that needs to be understood, it is that education is the absolute central feature of development. Because without education, nothing else can happen. And so the European imperial powers left the world illiterate, left their colonies basically illiterate. At the end of the colonial rule, the first thing that happened was mass education. We're still not there yet. But this is the most fundamental breakthrough that happened after World War II, the end of the colonial imperial era. And the United States does its empire in a different way through regime change operations, so it's not exactly the same as the occupation imperialism. But what countries got with their sovereignty was the ability to educate their people. And this has led to economic convergence. Just to show you the gaps, the peak of North Atlantic power was 1950 compared to the rest of the world. 56% of the literate world in 1950, roughly by my calculation, was in the North Atlantic region, meaning Western Europe, the United States, and Canada. Now it's 13% of the literate world. 60% of world output was in the North Atlantic region. Now it's 33% at purchasing power prices. 53% of all urban residents were in the North Atlantic world in 1950. Now it's 14%. The world's converged. Urban, literate, technologies have spread. Adam Smith was right that trade was actually the fundamental carrier of this. It was when China opened up that the acceleration of technological change came so fast to China. It was Japan that invented this process of rapid infusion of technology in the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and then again after World War II in its rebuilding. So we now see that Asia and the North Atlantic regions have crossed paths, again, using Madison's data updated by IMF data. The North Atlantic was the dominant power until this gap started to close in 1950. And by around 2010, Asia is now larger than the North Atlantic region. This is the real change of the world. We know that the BRICS, even before the recent expansion to 6 more countries, were already larger than the G7. That's a transformed world. And China, of course, overtook the US in GDP measured at purchasing power parity around 2014. But China is still much poorer per capita, maybe a third, but with more than 4 times the population. So this is the reason that China is a larger economy. So I want to argue very briefly that we're in a new age which I call the age of sustainable development. We're there in part because the scale of economic activity and a population 10 times the size of when Thomas Robert Malthus wrote The Principles of Population in 1798, which was then about 900 million people, and today 8 billion people, now has put so much pressure on the physical environment that we are in urgent need of global public response to climate, biodiversity destruction, loss of ecosystem functions, and so forth. And the world adopted goals addressed to this. It's fitfully trying to achieve them. Today at the UN, this very day, is the midpoint review of the Sustainable Development Goals. They're way off track. Nice objectives not being achieved, mainly because the United States and other rich countries don't care at all about it. And so the world governance is not organized to achieve these goals at this point. But these goals are the real global goals and needs. So we have a very perilous moment because we have arrived at multipolarity. And as Adam Smith talked about, that balance of awe and equality of force to create justice, that's a delicate, difficult transformation. And just to say, there are several different theories of what's going on right now. Robert Kagan, whom you may know is our chief neocon ideologue and the husband of our acting Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, believes that American hegemony must rule and will continue to rule. Otherwise, the jungle will grow back, as he says. Wow. Henry Kissinger says that we need a balance of power theory. Balance of power is okay, except it becomes imbalanced, and it's extremely difficult to manage. And when Bismarck was thrown out by Kaiser Wilhelm II, it was the end of Europe's balance of power, and World War I came in response when Bismarck's genius at balancing was lost. John Mearsheimer says we are inevitably in tragedy. That's just the nature of great power politics. Mearsheimer is extremely intelligent, predictive, an extremely nice person, but tragic to read because he says that conflict is inevitable. I don't buy it. Now, another theory that I read 50 years ago of a wonderful professor of mine also, Charles Kindleberger, said we need a hegemon. So if it's not the US or Britain, it's got to be someone else like China. I don't buy that either, but this is a brilliant book. Boy, it led to a lot of late night discussions over the next 50 years. Graham Allison says, as with Sparta and Athens, we're prone for war, not inevitable, but the war trigger is very high because of the rise of China. And my little contribution is, could we get our heads together and address global public goods and avoid global public bad? So I argue that we need a rational approach, not a tragic approach, and that it is not beyond us to reach the cooperative corner of the prisoner's dilemma. In other words, we can understand the game, we can understand the risks of defection, but we can understand the benefits of cooperation. And so we should be able to reach that cooperative outcome. So I would argue that we need a new geopolitics and a new ethics of sustainable development. I often refer to President Kennedy's inaugural address when he said, "The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." So what hangs in the balance is something extraordinary. We could achieve SDG 1, end poverty, or we could blow up the world. And what is absolutely incredible is how this is in the hands of a very few people. That's what's incredible. And by the way, my takeaway from Oppenheimer was what a bunch of geniuses that invented the bomb and what a bunch of dolts who use it or decide about using it. This is our paradox. It took the greatest geniuses of the age to understand nuclear fission and how this could be created, and then it fell into the hands of the everyday person who might not have the imagination to keep us away from global disaster. That's technology, by the way. Technology is often created by geniuses and used by all of us, and that is the real issue that Plato was wondering about already in the Republic 2,350 years ago. How do you make the rulers know what to do? He said you have to raise them from birth for that purpose. So there are crucial public goods at regional and global scale. This is something new. Regional scale, like the European Union or ASEAN or African Union, this is something new, how important this scale is. And global scale is almost unprecedented in human history. We had global trade, we had interconnectedness, but global public goods, not so much. Now we are with the center of global public goods, but institutions in the hands of nation states. Why? Weird. So I believe we need new kinds of global governance and ethics, and I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a good place to start. We're in the 75th anniversary this year, and I believe that we can even find a common wisdom, which I call the ABCs of ancient wisdom, Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. They all, by the way, were virtue ethicists. They basically said, cultivate your soul as decent people. It said it in somewhat different ways, but they said it's virtue that gives us the capacity to reach the cooperative solution, whether it's civic virtue, friendship virtue, or the other virtues of sociality. And Aristotle said it's possible because we are zoon politikon, we are political animals. We can be sociable. And so I think finding this commonality of East and West is crucial now, because there actually is a strong commonality of the underlying cultures. This was already pointed out in the observations of the axial age, that these philosophies arose roughly the same time and with roughly the same philosophical underpinnings. And I'll just end with President Kennedy's remarks 60 years ago. We're at the 60th anniversary of Kennedy's remarkable initiative to make peace at the height of the Cold War and to negotiate the partial nuclear test ban treaty, which was ratified just these days 60 years ago. Kennedy may well have been killed for it because rogue elements of the US government hated him for his peace initiatives, and I believe that this is probably what did him in. But he made wonderful observations about peace, and I'll just end with his most beautiful words. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Thank you very much.